Welcome to the workshop, Engaging People in Their Privileged Identities. Now, over the years, as I've worked with people who are speaking, behaving out of their privileged identities, I've experienced some common patterns, what I've come to call potholes, comments, behaviors that can undermine learning goals and throw a wrench in the group dynamics. And the more we're aware of these, and many others that I won't even mention, and if we can anticipate how they might occur and then we're prepared to respond effectively, we'll have a far better chance we can use these moments as productive teaching moments and get the learning back on track. Now, I first heard some of these types of potholes from LCY Cross Associates and called them traps. And we fall into conversations about equity inclusion. We fall into these potholes as privileged identity folk all the time. Now, as I go through them, how many of these have you said or thought or experienced? So there are so many potholes. That wasn't my intent. You can refer back to the facilitation workbook and you'll see some other strategies to deal with each of these as well as others, pages of tools and approaches. In this case, and every case, I usually ask for more information, tell me more, can you give me an example? And then there's some other tools that I might use, and that's what I want to highlight in this next part of the video. So if someone says that wasn't my intent, a tool could be, well, I'm open to hearing your intent, but first, I'd appreciate your acknowledging the impact of your comments. Or another tool, I hear that, I trust that, but even if we have no conscious malicious intent, our behaviors can still impact others. What do you think the impact of your comments, your tone may have been? So another trap, the reason I said that was, and so they're coming out of defensiveness and fragility. Actually, I've done all of these. So as you're listening, you may want to think, from my privileged identities, a number of different privileged identities, when have I wanted to do this or when have I fallen into this pothole? So a tool. So I'm noticing your reaction. I'm wondering if we can pause a moment. My sense is you're feeling defensive. Can you talk about just what you're feeling, what's going on for you right now? So that could be a way to just get them focused on what's going on in them. They might be able to notice and then come back more present and engage in a dialogue. Or another tool. I remember saying something pretty much like that not too long ago. And someone gave me a heads up about the unintended impact of my comments. I appreciated knowing because I didn't want to offend others or make them uncomfortable or make a mistake. And I realized that regardless of intent, there's an impact. So what do you think the impact of what you said and how you said it might have been? And then finally, another tool. Regardless of our reasons, it's important to recognize the possible impact of what we're having on others. So what's your sense of the impact given what people have shared? And what were you wanting to accomplish with your comment and your action? So all of those can help with the reason I said that or that wasn't my intent, which are very much first cousins. So another one, that happens to me too, is very common in privileged identities. I remember when I was denying that race was happening, I just didn't want to believe there was racism. So I was like, that happens to me too. Happens to other people I know who aren't people of color. So a tool, this dynamic and situation does happen to other groups too, other marginalized groups, but the difference might be how often it happens to people in privileged identities and why it happens to them. For instance, most whites have received bad customer service. I know I have. But it rarely happens to me or other whites because of some prejudice people have towards us as whites. And it probably doesn't happen to us as frequently as it does to people of color. And more often than not, the bad negative treatment towards people of color has a race overtone. Or a tool, that happens to me too. So how does it feel when it happens to you? And then they talk about their feelings and that's a window on what it might be like for folks in marginalized identities who get this all the time. Because how often does that happen to you? And more likely than not, they'll say, well, occasionally. And then why does it happen to you? So with these tools, the first one was kind of telling and sharing. This one is asking questions to help them maybe come to their own awareness. And then again, now you've got a window of understanding to connect to what maybe some people in marginalized groups probably experience much of the time. And this one, I know someone who, from the marginalized identity, and they don't agree with you. It's a variation of that happens to me. It's that it doesn't happen to others. And so the tool could be, that might be that some folks in that marginalized identity don't see this as I've been told or as I do. That doesn't discount the experiences and the perceptions from folks in this marginalized identity. Or another tool, not all blank may feel like I do. So not all folks of color may agree with what I'm saying that happens around race. And unfortunately, there are so many other people of color who do agree with me. I've heard stories over and over. I've had white people who actually do these behaviors of people of color, or have said they've seen this happen to folks of color. Are you open to hearing more about what I have seen and the experience of people in the room? And another tool. Sometimes a person's intersecting privilege identities might buffer or compensate for the marginalized experiences they have. Or they may not notice them, or they may not experience them to the same intensity or degree. And they may not have realized what's occurring around them. I remember as I look back, I didn't understand sexism or heterosexism. And as I look back, I was experiencing it all the time as a teenager in my 20s. I just didn't recognize it yet. So another pothole, that has nothing to do with, in this case, I'll talk about race. And so if you have a white person saying, that has nothing to do with race, you could say, well, what if it did? How would you feel if it turned out that this example was all about racist behavior and racist attitudes? How would you feel? What would that mean for you? Or another tool, as a white person, I can say, I remember saying that many times. And then people of color gave me feedback. I started realizing that what I was doing had a negative impact. So I started listening, paying attention more. And I've observed and experienced this type of situation so many times. And I've heard the impact over and over from people of color, these types of behaviors and policies that we whites do and create. So here's the way I see it. And then tell a little bit more and then say, anybody relate? And gather in some group folks who might be willing to share. And that can be from the privileged group identity or the marginalized. Now, often folks in privileged group identities, when someone in the marginalized identity will share with some emotion or some clarity or directness, the comeback pothole is, well, you're overreacting. You're just too sensitive. And so a tool to use in that moment is we're engaging people in their privileged identities. Now, I wonder if you can relate to ever feeling discounted and disrespected so often that it builds up. Can you remember? I don't know. Well, I do. And you can tell a story out of another privileged identity. And I could talk about lesbian or woman, just daily microaggressions. So when one more happens and I react with a bit more energy or more directness than they're used to, I'm not overreacting. I'm reacting in a very reasonable way to the amount that's happening to me and other folks in a marginalized group. So another tool, you could say to the full group, can anybody relate to feeling the cumulative impact of all that exclusionary treatment? Anybody willing to just come on and relate and share? Or another tool, to someone that says, you're overreacting, you're too sensitive. You know, you may not agree, but I feel strongly about this. And when you say I'm overreacting, I want to end the conversation, and I probably won't talk to you about similar issues again or much of anything else. Now, I can do that as a privileged identity person. I can also do it out of the corresponding marginalized. And one final tool, when someone says, you're too sensitive, you know, your intent might be to try to help or support me or make me feel better, but the impact of that statement, I'm overreacting, is really infuriating. I'd really appreciate you just respecting me enough to hear and acknowledge my perspective. What do you hear me saying? Now, again, this one I particularly gave you several with increasing clarity, directness, so that you can have them in your toolkit and decide how many you want to teach in different workshops or when you're coaching and how many you want to use. Again, I generally start with least confrontive if the folks can hear me and the dynamic will shift, but sometimes my sense is that last one, when you say that, your intent might be to be supportive, but the impact is infuriating. And I just need you to hear me and respect me enough to acknowledge my perspective. Now that is clear and direct. And there are days that that's important to do because folks may not hear you unless you have that tool that you might use sometime. And the last one on this slide, this last pothole, this is right from LCY Cross Associates, the PLE. There's a perfectly logical explanation on why that has nothing to do with X. And then they might tell you. And so I have a few tools. One is, there may be a number of factors that contributed to that situation, but I believe in my soul one of them has to do with race. And let me tell you why I think that. Or, when you say that, I feel you're discounting my experience. In that situation, I believe that gender was a central reason for how he reacted to me. Or, you could be right, that in this one individual specific situation, it had nothing to do with bias or prejudice. But that moment seems so familiar to so many other times in my experience that I have been treated negatively and experienced discrimination. It's hard not to assume that this is just like all those other times. I like that one a lot, by the way. And a final tool for this one, if someone gives you a PLE, what would it mean if my perception, my experience as I've shared it is true? What would that mean? That this person did react out of bias, out of stereotypes, intentionally or not, but they were coming out of implicit bias. What would it mean if that were true? We'll take a deep breath. I have just a few more potholes. This one, privileged folks' identity. Often in our privilege, we do not believe people in their marginalized identity. We still may be in denial. We may be in judgment of them if they just worked harder, pulled themselves up by their bootstraps, if they just took advantage of all that we give them. So all those oppressive, internalized dominance thoughts. And people in privileged identities who may still be, if you remember the path to competence, not only denial, judgment, might sound like they're blaming, especially out of judgment, blaming folks. Well, if you just were as good as this other person who's in the marginalized identity, if you just had a better attitude, if you just were more professional. So out of that biased stereotype energy, it'll be, well, give me an example and give me another example. And they just need more and more examples trying to explain away the first example. They'll shoot at each one, try to shoot them down. They won't see the pattern. And so there are a variety of ways to engage when someone out of their privileged identity directly asks for an example, particularly from someone from the corresponding marginalized identity. So if I'm facilitating, I'll take a beat and I'll check the nonverbals of the person they seem to direct the comment to. Now, if they said it to the whole group, I might take 2 beats and just watch and see if anybody wants to come in. Now, if folks seem hesitant, I might say, even though the question was directed to you, if you want, you can answer for sure. But I could pose that question to the whole group, and my guess is there'll be a number of people, particularly folks in the privileged identity, who could answer and give some examples. I know I sure can. Now, I'm not saving, rescuing, but I am interrupting the demanding, entitled energy of the person of privileged identity. Well, give me an example. And it's coming out of disbelief and almost scorn. Now, as I take a beat to watch, if the person of corresponding marginalized identity seems to want to answer and they start to say something, then I'll listen, I'll thank them, and I'll acknowledge, affirm what they said, and I might say, anybody else relate? Because the original person of privileged identity, if they hear from 3 or 4 different people, more stories, then they might go, oh, okay, and they might start to see the pattern. So I might gather a few more examples. Now, I'm paying attention, I'm panning to notice if the people sharing are all in the marginalized group. Then I'll say, what do folks notice about who's sharing the examples? And hopefully someone will say they're all in the marginalized group. So then I'll say, so what examples can folks share from the privileged group that either you've observed, you've seen them happen from other folks in our group, or you've done them? And then see if we can get some stories there. Then I might go back to the original person and say, so you asked for an example. My guess is I think we had 4 or 5. What are you hearing is the pattern? So again, I'm trying to help them grow and develop and join, as opposed to, because I could say, so do you get it now? Which would not be useful. But try to help them be a part of the conversation. What's the pattern you hear? What's the impact you hear? What do you think's going on for folks in the privileged identities who do these behaviors? Any of that might get that person back feeling present, because at this point they may feel on the outside. And again, I believe you leave no one behind. Now, they may choose to leave emotionally and just energetically not be present. But my job as facilitator, I believe our job is to give folks a chance to come back in and be a part of the learning. And then if some folks in their privileged identity share some, then I might reflect, make it a teachable moment and say, I used to believe and think that I could only learn about this type of oppression from people in the marginalized identities. And I kept asking and going to workshops and listening, or talk to people on the street or people I knew. And I never realized the extra burden and the emotional tax that I was putting on them until, of course, a few told me. So now I realize that actually, just like we just did, we can get a lot of information from members of our own privileged identities and do our own work, reading, watching videos, listening hard. And so I just want to remind us all, me particularly, that I can keep learning with people of my own group, and I don't have to burden folks in the marginalized. Now, if folks in privileged groups do not show up, I might say, I remember a few years back, I wouldn't have been able to give many examples, right off the cuff. It's taken lots of listening, reading, and paying attention to everyday interactions, watching for those microaggressions, seeing those dynamics, the policies that have a negative differential impact. So that now I have a few. And so here are a couple that relate to what some of y'all I heard say. And I'd share a few and say, anyone relate? Because after I share, say as a white person or someone with class privilege or someone with ability privilege, then other folks might go, oh yeah, that reminds me. So if I model, use self as instrument out of my privileged identity, also acknowledging the dynamic. So I have two more potholes. When you shift the conversation, your privileged identity, and you shift the conversation away from a focus on the privileged group and what we do to one of your marginalized identities. So whenever I'm leading white affinity space, white caucus space, accountability spaces, or the race of racism as a conversation, people inevitably, white folks, try to shift to focus movement off of race and onto one of their marginalized identities or another marginalized identity, even if it's not theirs. It could be, my son has a disability, and we're not talking about that. And it's a variation of that happens to me too, and not everything is about race. So it's all variations of similar potholes. I remember saying, I'm a lesbian, and that's important too, right? So in those kind of situations, what I know is when folks in their privileged identity shifted to a marginalized, there could be a whole bunch of motives. And so you can actually just say, I noticed you just did that. What do you think's going on for you? And it could be they're in pain, cumulative impact of their oppression. They're feeling their marginalized identity is pretty invisible in the conversation, not only here, but in the organization. And also they may be feeling uncomfortable in the privileged identity with the focus on it, having to look at oppressive behaviors, oppressive prejudice and bias. They may see themselves in those examples and not want to own it. And so let's, go into fragility and not have to talk about it anymore. And they might be in real denial that they don't believe this is a very important form of oppression. Theirs is more important. They're playing the oppression Olympics. So a tool. I noticed you just spoke about X, a different marginalized identity, and you shift our focus away from talking about Y, the privileged identity we were talking about. Can you say what's going on for you? Or, I want to get to your comment because I think it's also important we talk about X, but I don't want to move too quickly from talking about these dynamics of privilege. So let's park your comment. I'll write it up here on the chart. And why don't we come back to talking about the privilege dynamics? And then I'd ask them to see if they want to come back in. So can you relate as a Y? In this case, if we're talking race, can you relate as a white person to anything that's been shared? What have you seen as a white person? What have you seen other whites say, seen us do that's related to what's already been shared? And see if they can. Now, one final pothole, we're only speaking out of our marginalized identities. And in workshops, it could be race, it could be sex assigned at birth, gender, it could be if people identify as transgender, gender nonconforming, those are the three I've seen. Sometimes white folks only talk out of hierarchical dynamics of microaggressions and oppression, often class, low income, working class background, and that's the only thing they'll talk about. And so if I'm doing a foundational workshop, I think it's critical that we support folks looking at the full breadth of all differences and look at their own membership in both privileged and marginalized identities and recognize the common microaggressions that their privileged groups perpetuate and in their marginalized identities, the ones their groups experience, whether or not they've perpetuated or experienced in themselves, but to get that group level. So I notice that some people are only sharing out their marginalized identities. I'm thinking I want to engage them also out of their privileged identities. Now, to be fair, it is hard to own. I remember for years, I could not own white privilege, class privilege, my ability privilege, US privilege. I was in so much pain, anger, grief, fear, shame, guilt for my marginalized identities. I was still in internalized oppression, as well as cumulative impact from the daily microaggressions and the policies and practices were so oppressive. And when in our marginal identities, we feel our issues are not fully heard, acknowledged, or explored, it is a lot to expect folks to also own and claim and speak out of their privileged identities. And so in your design, I want to make sure as you've done all these weeks of work, you'll now reflect that I really have people have many opportunities to speak from their marginalized identities, from the playing card activity to the when we marginalize to gallery activity, to the microaggression activity, to the socialization activity. So there's lots of room in a foundational work. But some tools in this case might be that you might shift to speak more about marginalized identities and say, why don't we take a moment, everyone reflect, what have you personally experienced or members of your group experience? And you can move into a gallery experience. You could just have more dialogue about it. You could introduce the concept of cumulative impact and say, take a moment, reflect back over the last couple of weeks and just kind of what's a common day in your life as no names, but just what are 2 or 3, 5 or 10 things that just are almost predictable that'll happen as you go around all your daily activities. And so you do that in a large group maybe. I've never thought of this before. I'm just extroverting in the moment. And then have people read them. Or if they really write them out, you could trade them, have people read them aloud. And as a fill in the blank marginal identity, this is a typical day. And just 3 or 4 things that happen. You could then have people talk about, as you heard this, what are you feeling? What are you noticing? And they'll say there are common dynamics across many marginalized identities. But if we're not paying attention to them, all we're talking about is our own marginalized identity, we may miss them. And then I might ask, so as you hear some of these, if you're in the corresponding privilege group, what did you hear? And what did you hear was the impact of the type of exclusionary comments and behaviors that are just everyday experiences for folks that we might be missing? And so that's kind of a gentle nudge after we've had much more room to talk about marginalization. If I do marginalized caucuses, I would have people identify what they want to talk about. And so long as there's just one other person to talk with, then I ask people to move to where they have energy and they want to share. You might have folks who do not have a current marginalized identity, and so I might have them reflect back when they were younger, when they were new to an organization, or when they had a level position in the organization that was pretty marginalized, and ask them to maybe go to that. Now, if you already have one of folks that are in low, quote, level organizations, I might, if you have 2 or 3 people, and they're usually white, cisgender, heterosexual, male, identifies Christian, able-bodied, U.S. born, and I could keep going, born with class privilege, then I would maybe have, if there's more than one, talk among themselves, because it's hard to hear people in the current marginalized identity if you're in the current privilege identity. You might go to the Yale butt, and it doesn't happen like that. It has nothing to do, and happens to me too, and all those potholes. So those are some of my thoughts about that. And then I've sometimes reflected, so while it may be new, if you ought to think about your various privileged identities, I know it's hard to see privileges that we get when we're simultaneously still experiencing daily microaggressions. and our marginalized identities. But I believe in my soul, we will make far more progress, far more quickly, and we'll be able to truly create a more inclusive, socially just organization when we all have the capacity to recognize and easily talk about our experiences, both in our marginalized and our privileged identities, and how the intersections of all those impact how I'm seen, treated, heard by people who know me and by people who don't know me. We're most powerful when we fluidly move in and out of talking about all of our identities, how they intersect and how they influence our lives. And we're able to share personal examples at the individual level, as well as common patterns of experience at the group level, even if they're not our own. But talk about, well, here's what I know happens to women. And you might even say, I haven't personally experienced that, but I've seen it happen so many times. So take a deep breath. And then again, as we're talking about engaging people out of their privileged identity, I would then model using myself as instrument as naming my privileged identity, talk about a few of my privileged groups, what I've done, observed, what the impact I've seen on folks in the corresponding marginalized identity, and then ask, can anybody relate to any of these privileged identities? Do you have any other examples you can tell, or any other privileged identities I haven't mentioned? Again, if I share 2 or 3 depths of authenticity, bravery, clarity, deeper than I think people can go right now, then a few people might be able to meet me 1 or 2 levels, and somebody might be able to go 1 more level, and then we might have a powerful conversation of relating in. I heard you say this is someone with class privilege. Well, I have cisgender privilege, and this is what my experience is, what I've seen. And someone else might say, I was born in the US, and now I realize, given nationality, and English is a first language, here's my privilege, or here's what I've seen as a microaggression. Now, there are a number of handouts in the workbooks that I use to help people acknowledge, own, and talk about their privileges, including using the group identity cards. But one I just want to highlight here is the unproductive privilege group dynamics common patterns. Unproductive privilege group dynamics. I use that in full cross privileged marginalized spaces. I use it in caucus, affinity spaces, mixed groups. It's an incredibly useful tool. And I've had people in the privileged identity go, I've done all of them or most all of them, and I've seen all of them done. And it's just an easier way to move more quickly into talking about internalized dominance and how we act out of those oppressive beliefs. And in our marginalized identities, I've had folks, particularly folks of colors where I've used it most often, will say, it's really powerful to see all these racist behaviors and attitudes of whites all in one place. Now, it's only 41, but still, it's a lot. It just helps me realize it's not me, and it's not an isolated incident, that it really is part of the culture and the climate that's embedded in the organization and in our society. So while it could be more challenging, incredible growth and shifts can happen. So it can be more challenged to ask people to be in their privilege, to engage them when they're doing potholes. There's resistance, there's conflict and energy. But when we effectively engage people in their privileged identities, when they fall into these traps and potholes, there can be incredible shifts that can happen, awareness, insights, and behavior change. As well as we invite and support all participants to speak out of their privileged identities as well as their marginalized. I'll see you in the next video.